And now let's talk about what represents sort of a rough outline for the buy side process. So if you're advising on the buy side, we're going to talk about the sell side in just a moment. But if you are involved in trying to provide advisory services for a buyer, your client is a buyer, what does that look like? Well, when the client's the acquirer, the M&A process can roughly be broken out into four stages. One is sort of assessing, finding potential targets. Second phase is contacting those targets, then pursuing the actual deal and doing what's called due diligence. And lastly is sort of signing the definitive agreement and all the work that goes along with actually closing a deal. This takes anywhere from 16 to 36 weeks on average, but of course larger deals can take far longer than that. So let's look at those four periods in a little bit more detail. And so in that first period, that preliminary assessment phase, from the perspective of the buyer and the investment bank, it's about reviewing the competitive landscape, working collaboratively to understand the landscape, to identify potential targets, and to define some sort of rough acquisition timetable. And I've inserted little icons here that sort of designate that a lot of junior investment banking work is about sort of putting these kinds of documentations together. You saw a little bit of that. The pitch book represents really a very preliminary document. Once you get deeper into a deal where the buyers actually express some interest in pursuing something, then you look at potential targets, and we'll look at some pitch books like that in just a moment. The second period is about actually contacting targets and performing some valuation of targets. And so this is a process of contacting candidates, negotiating what's called a non-disclosure agreement or a confidentiality agreement, and performing some preliminary target valuations based on the information that you get back from those targets. And that valuation work, again, represents the heart of what we've been talking about and what we're going to do in this course. It's about building an operating model for the target. It's about building a DCF model for that target. It's about spreading comps for the target, both trading and transaction comps. And lastly, it's about building a merger model that analyzes what happens when my company, the buyer, merges with the seller. What are the implications? What do those pro forma financials or combined financials look like? Again, I've sort of noted that this is, again, a lot of junior banker work is putting these numbers together. The next period is about actually going through the deal. Presumably, if we've been able to narrow down a potential target, that target or sometimes targets receive an LOI, letters of intent from us, the buyer. At this point, more complete valuation analyses are done. This is fairly iterative, so these deal books are now being turned over pretty frequently as negotiations are taking place and different parameters are discussed. Business due diligence begins to get conducted, and that means you're continuing to do more and more in-depth industry analysis as you're getting more and more information from the target company. You're asking for more information, you're getting more information, and so the due diligence is part of this. Overview of products and services, site visits. These are things that are happening. Some of these are more junior banker heavy, other are more senior bank heavy. Again, I've noted sort of where most of the junior bank work is taking place. Financial due diligence, you're reviewing typically a ton of documentation. Documents are coming in. You're looking at sort of how the company's doing on an increasingly granular level. The final period is really the definitive agreement and closing. At this point, you're sort of finalizing the due diligence. You are negotiating the final definitive agreement. Again, this is mostly the senior bankers, the lawyers, are working directly with the clients at this point to sort of get the final touches. The role of the junior bankers primarily about sort of turning over the underlying analysis to reflect what's being negotiated at this point by the buyer and the seller. Securing financing. So to the extent that you need to borrow money, that the buyer is going to need to borrow money in order to do this deal or issue stock to do this deal, there's going to be there are going to be a whole bunch of things that need to get done. So required SEC filings, shareholder and regulatory approvals, along with all the legal and tax work that goes along with that. And ideally, once all is said and done and everything is working well, the transaction closes.